right, we are back on Wednesday for our Q&A. Now, busy week in my household this week. I have one daughter who last night actually, graduated from high school. And then my other daughter, my younger daughter, she turns 16 tomorrow. So super busy around, but there was no way I was gonna take Wednesday off and not get to the Q&A for the week, because to me, again, this is my favorite part of the week. If you are just joining us for the first time, every week I will hit 5 questions from all of you and give you my opinion, my take on the answer, and kind of the thought process that I go through with a topic or with a question. So I have to have people continue to post great questions in order for this to be interesting. So if you have any questions that you'd like me to answer, please take a second. Right down below, go ahead and post your question that I can answer next week. As long as I continue to get great questions, I will continue to give my input. So do that, but let's go ahead and take a look at the first question right now.
Back in the late 90s, BGS carried a premium over PSA due to the perception of stricter grading standards. Would it make sense in today's climate to search out old BGS graded cards from that time frame, crack them, and submit them to PSA?
All right, I love this question. And the reason I love this question is because I love the thought process. The thought process is looking for a competitive advantage. What is something, given the current situation, that we can do, that we can add value, that we can make a smart decision and think about things a little bit differently than how others think about them, to maybe acquire some amount of value that otherwise people might be missing. There's no doubt about it that, PSA was really the first one into the grading market, and not long after, SGC and Beckett got involved. And BGS did become kind of the tougher grader, and there was definitely a premium, and we're talking all the way back to like the late 90s at this point, in early 2000s, that BGS, if you had a high grade in a BGS, it tended to be worth more than PSA. And it stayed that way for a while. One of the things for me personally is SGC has always been a company that was more into the vintage market, and PSA was always more into the vintage market than BGS. But BGS at the beginning, was kind of whatever was coming in, people were doing vintage and modern. Now, if you look at where they're all positioned today, BGS tends to be the kind of, modern card with an auto. So it's the auto grade and the card grade. That's tending to be where people go. So that BGS 9.5 of like an RPA or an auto card is where a lot of people are going. PSA seems to kind of be the one who's hitting the broadest market. There, a lot of modern stuff and still a lot of vintage stuff. And then SGC tends to have their biggest share of the market in the vintage stuff. So when we talk about BGS way back, there aren't a ton of vintage cards that were graded or have been graded or are graded by BGS. But I do like this thought process. I think if you were to look back and find an old BGS grade and it looks like a nice card, I think it is a card that I would consider cracking. And the reason that I would consider cracking it is not so much because I think BGS was a tougher grader, but because so many people like to have the uniformity in their collection. So if you're a PSA person, a lot of people just have PSA slabs, and a lot of people have SGC slabs. And a lot of people want to keep the consistency throughout. So because there aren't a ton of BGS graded vintage cards, there are a lot of people out there that I think would probably not even really look at a vintage card graded by BGS because they just type in their search, or they go and they look in the case and they're looking for the PSA slabs or the SGC slabs, and a lot of vintage collectors are not collecting BGS slabs. Now, there's also a group of people who don't care what slab it's in. They just want the card. And so that wouldn't, those particular collectors, there wouldn't be much of an advantage to. But yes, I do think if you took a third-party company and you really look at the card, because remember, it's always about the card, not the grade that BGS gave 30 years ago. But if you look the card over really well and you say, you know what, I think this is going to get the same or better grade in a PSA or an SGC holder, I do think you would be adding value, putting it into a BGS, out of a BGS and into an SGC or PSA holder, because so many collectors collect one of those two. And I think it would broaden the audience of potential buyers and people interested. I think it would be an interesting experiment at least, but I definitely think there's a possibility that it could sell for more in a PSA or SGC slab than a BGS slab, even though 30 years ago, the BGS slabs are the ones that had the premium. I think it's a really good point. I think it's a really good way to think about, is there an advantage here? And those are the sorts of things that we should or could be doing to add some value and pick up some cards and get an advantage out of it.
Why does a player's card go up in value when they die?
What a relevant question. This is so relevant. I mean, I went to that card show that I posted a video on Friday afternoon, and at the show, the whole kind of talk of the show that afternoon was that Jim Brown had died. And when Jim Brown dies, you know, it was interesting in the show because there were literally, as the word was spreading, there were dealers who were taking their Jim Brown cards out of their cases and putting them away. They were taking the stickers off of the cards, not knowing what is this going to do to the values. And there were other people that I saw out there that were literally going table to table saying, do you have any Jim Brown cards? And nothing changed in Jim Brown's career, right? There isn't like it's not like there are more Jim Brown 1959 Topps cards that are going to be printed, or less that are going to be printed now that he's died. The only thing that happened is he's no longer alive. Now, with a lot of these older athletes, I mean, there are a lot of guys that are getting up there that are legends. I mean, Willie Mays is really getting up there in age, and he's not going to be around forever. And so the thought process of the question is, what does happen to card values when a player passes away? Now, I'm going to do a follow-up video on this particular topic in the next week or so, because I think it deserves a real thorough investigation and see what happens with Jim Brown card values, because I think people might be surprised what actually happens long-term and short-term, and long-term versus short-term with cards when something like this happens. But to answer the question, what happens is, I think there are a lot of players out there that we kind of just, we kind of forget about their greatness, right? You know, another player who's getting up there in age is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? And, you know, when Jim Brown passes away, there's all these highlights of Jim Brown. We're like, man, yeah, he was great. And there's all these, you know, headlines about how Jim Brown was, you know, not just a football player, but did a lot for society and did a lot for, different groups. And we go, yeah, he was kind of almost even a political figure, and he did some good things in this world beyond just on the football field. And we're watching these highlights of how amazing he is, and we're hearing people talk about how he's one of the greatest players of all time. And so when that becomes on our radar, we go, yeah, I need a Jim Brown card. And it just reminds us of them. It's not that the supply drops. The supply of Jim Brown cards is set, right? The thing that happens is we think about them, we're reminded of them, and there's a spike in the demand. Is the spike long term? I don't know. Is the spike short term? We'll have to see. But there is usually a spike in the demand. And what happens to the prices depends on, right, supply and demand. So again, I'm going to do a follow-up in this, but I think the question of why does their card go up when they pass away really has to do about reminding us of their greatness, seeing those clips, reading those headlines, and going, oh yeah, I don't have a Jim Brown card. I want a Jim Brown card. He's one of the best football players of all time. And so the demand, at least temporarily, goes up. And by the demand going up, the price tends to go up, even though the number of cards that are out there of Jim Brown haven't changed. So I think that answers the question. But again, I'm going to go into more in depth into this topic soon and include things like, why does a card go up for some players when they make the Hall of Fame, but not others? Why does the value of some cards and some players go way up when they pass away, but not others? So I'm going to talk about that in an upcoming video. But I think for the short term, the main reason is increase in demand. That's the reason that there is a at least temporary spike in values of players' cards.
What do you prefer, raw or graded vintage cards for your PC?
I think that this is an interesting one. So what do I personally prefer? That's the question. Is what do I prefer, raw or graded? I wish we could go back and there not be grading companies. I think grading companies have created a lot of controversy. I think getting cards graded has caused some people to speculate about some shenanigans out there. And at the end of the day, I believe touching cards, even smelling cards, one of my favorite YouTube channels is Breakout Cards. And the guy on Breakout Cards, his name is Ryan Nolan, right? Not Nolan Ryan, Ryan Nolan. And Ryan wrote a book about how to spot fakes on cards. And one of the things he talks about is one of the ways to tell if a card is a fake or not is by smelling it. And I've heard other people talk about it. I've seen other people do it. And if you take a vintage card and you smell it, it literally has like a musty smell. It's like an old library book. And if it's a fake, it won't smell like an old library book. And there's something about being able to smell the card and touch the card. It's like I'm not into wine. I'm not into wine at all, but a lot of people are into wine. And you'll see somebody who's really into wine and they'll swirl the wine and they'll smell the wine and they'll sip the wine and they'll do these different things to really enjoy the wine. Well, I'm not into wine and I don't smell wine and I don't sip wine, but I appreciate that other people do. And to me, feeling the cards, feeling the texture of the card, and looking at a raw card is really the way it was designed to be. Being slabbed in this acrylic, this plastic, is not the way it was designed to be. We don't get to touch them, we don't get to feel them. The textures have changed over the years. The smell, is really a part of it. And so I absolutely prefer raw cards. Most of the cards that I buy are graded, but I have a lot of raw cards as well. And I know a lot of people hate them being called raw cards. They just want to call them ungraded or graded. I get that. I say raw because that's how most of us refer to them. But I wish that I didn't have to have any card graded. But again, I've said this before, I'll continue to harp on it. Because of the internet, because of online marketplaces, because we buy cards from people across the country or even across the world, the only way we can get a real good idea of the condition of this three-dimensional object by looking at a two-dimensional picture is if we have some third party that kind of has looked it over for us. Now, it's not going to be perfect. PSA is going to make mistakes, SGC is going to make mistakes, BGS they're all going to make mistakes at times. And I continue to say most of them are pretty good most of the time. But being able to have them go, yeah, it's a 6. I know there are no creases. I know there's no staining. I know there's no water damage, right? I know there are no wrinkles. I know there's not something that the picture is hiding. So I get a pretty good idea. It doesn't mean it's going to be what I think a 6 is. It might be what they think a 6 is, but I think a 5 is, or I think a 7 is. But it gives me a good idea of what it actually is looking like and what conditions it actually has. So I appreciate the fact that grading companies exist because they've made it easier for us to be globally collecting and trading and buying and selling. But at the end of the day, I like the texture of cards. I like going through cards and being able to touch and feel them and smell them and look at them through something besides a big, thick piece of plastic. So I think it's a necessary evil, but I prefer raw cards, but I mostly buy graded cards. And a lot of that, not just the condition thing, but it provides authentication. And most of the time, I think that it probably eliminates doctoring of cards as well. Although I know it's impossible to catch all of the doctored cards going through the process. So that's my answer. Prefer raw, but I understand that we benefit by having cards get graded by being able to be more of a global card collecting community.
Who are the best one-hit wonders in MLB history? In other words, non-Hall of Fame players known for doing only one incredible feat that would make their card collectible.
All right, one-hit wonders. Now, first of all, I'll say it's a great question. It's a really, really good question. It's a really interesting question. And I don't want to say anyone is just a one-hit wonder, because if you make it to the majors, you're kind of more than a one-hit wonder. You kind of have an established amount of talent and value and ability. So to say you're a one-hit wonder makes it seem like you only did this one thing. Like, you were the guy at halftime of a playoff game and made a 3/4 court shot for $1 million. Like, that's a true one-hit wonder. but I understand the question. I understand the point of the question. My mind immediately goes to two, and I don't know why I immediately go to baseball for this stat, but I immediately go to baseball, and I immediately think of two. And it's tough to call someone a one-hit wonder, because again, I feel like it is saying something negative about their career. But first one would be Don Larson. That comes to my mind, right? Don Larson throws a perfect game in the World Series. Famous clip of Yogi Berra running over, jumping on him, at the end of the game after the perfect game has happened. Don Larson has signed a lot of autographs. I met Don Larson at an autograph signing at a show in New Jersey back in 2001. Super nice guy. He was signing at a show. It was David Cohn was signing, David Wells was signing, and Don Larson, who were the three Yankees with perfect games. And a lot of people were getting balls with those three signatures on it. It was a cool event. But, Don Larson was a very good pitcher, but he wasn't amazing. He was about a 500 pitcher over his career. It's tough to say you're a one-hit wonder when you're a 500 pitcher in the major leagues over multiple years. But to answer your question, that would be one. I think the one that most people would go to is they would go after Roger Maris. Roger Maris was a very, very good player, but Roger Maris had one unbelievable season, and that one unbelievable season gathered a ton of attention because his record that he broke was Babe Ruth's, right? And then there was the asterisk because it was like, well, the season was a little bit longer than Babe Ruth's, so does it count the same? And Babe Ruth was so beloved, it was like, well, did he really earn it? And then, in our generation, there's the whole thing where Mark McGwire beat it in first, right? And Roger Maris's sons were at the game when he did it, and they had a ceremony, and Roger Maris's son looks just like Roger Maris. And so I think those are the two that would jump off the page to me. Another one I would say, and again, I don't want to ever disparage anyone, but Kerry Wood. Remember Kerry Wood from the Cubs? 20 strikeouts in a game. Clemens did it a couple of times, and Kerry Wood did it. And he was it might have been his rookie year. This is the very beginning of his career. And he just caught fire one afternoon and tied the all-time strikeouts in a single game of 20. And that would be the other person. But the question talks about which resulted in card collectivity. I don't think a lot of people are running out and buying Kerry Wood cards. And part of that has to do with the fact that he was, during the junk wax era. So those are the three that jump out at me. Again, I don't want to call anyone a one-hit wonder, but those are the three guys who had like one event or one record or one thing happen that makes you remember them for that event that aren't Hall of Fame players.
Why did you start a YouTube channel? And how did you choose the name MidLife Sports Cards?
So I appreciate this question because you're asking about me. And I know I don't talk about myself so much other than my collecting habits. So it's nice of you to ask that. That said, as a collector, it's really, really fun to go to card shows. And one of the reasons it's fun to go to card shows is because you're surrounded by other collectors, right? I posted a video this last weekend of me at a card show, and I'm having this discussion with a couple of dealers who I've become friends with, and we're just talking about, card collecting kind of opinions on things. And it is a lot of fun, And the problem is in my area, there might be 9 or 10 card shows a year that I can make it to that are within a couple of hours from me. And so you only get to have that 9 or 10 times a year. And it's a lot of fun to talk about cards. This is really enjoyable. This right here is really enjoyable for me. Hearing your questions, reading your questions, responding to questions, having people respond to my responses is really enjoyable. And so what doing this channel does is it allows me to have more connection to other collectors. It allows me to have discussions like this with other collectors using the technology at our disposal nowadays, that we're so lucky to live in a time where, I could be making friends all over the country, even all over the world. I mean, I've had viewers from other countries reach out to me and tell me that, they enjoy watching my channels or that particular video. And that's really cool. So to me, the main reason for it is it's a way to be able to have contact with the card collecting community every day instead of just 9 or 10 days of the year. That's a big part of it. Another big part of it is, I love cards and I love collecting cards and I have a good amount of cards. I don't have a ton of cards, but I don't have a ton of money. I'm just a simple teacher with a couple of high school kids, or had a 2 teenage daughters, and so I don't have a ton of disposable income to go out and go just buy cards. But I want to be involved in cards. I want to be talking about cards. I want to be in the card community, and this allows me to be connected to the card community without going out and spending hundreds of dollars all the time, just adding and adding and adding, because that's not really an option. So it allows me to connect with people, but it also allows me to be involved in the card collecting community without having to spend a ton of money buying. And quite frankly, I don't like to sell that much, so I don't sell a ton. So because of that, it puts me in a position where I can connect without having to spend all that money to be a part of the community. And then lastly, I am a teacher, and I've mentioned that several times. I'm a high school teacher. And so a lot of me is just a curious person. And so I'll think about things like, who are some guys that haven't made the Hall of Fame yet and might make the Hall of Fame soon through the Veterans Committee? Who are some vintage players with cards that might make the Hall of Fame? Because when they make the Hall of Fame, it tends to see that cards go up in value of those players because more people are collecting Hall of Famers. And so that curiosity in me, I'll go, I'm going to look into that. And then when I look into it, I go, well, as a teacher, it's just kind of natural to share the things that I've learned about my curiosities. So it's not so much that I feel like I'm teaching on the channel. I'm just sharing with others and asking, what do you guys think? Is this interesting to you? Do you agree that, this player might make the Hall of Fame soon, and that some players, when they make the Hall of Fame, it looks like their cards go up? Because this is kind of the evidence I see. What is your take on it? And it's fun to kind of throw those out to the card collecting community and to share those ideas and to talk about them. As far as midlife cards, hey, I was born in 1979. I haven't turned 44 yet. I'm still 43 at the moment. I'll be 44 here in about a month and 2 months. And I'm in the middle of my life, but that does not mean that, I'm going to have this midlife crisis. It means I'm just midlife. I'm a card collector, and that's where I am in life. Don't let the gray hair fool you. I am only born in 79. So, I just thought it was a fun kind of name for where I am in life and where I am with collecting. And last thing I'll say is, and I mentioned this in a couple of my videos, I feel like there's so much negativity in the world right now, with the whole pandemic thing, with some of the political strife that we've had, with some of the issues that have happened over the last, 3 or 4 years. I'm kind of a talk radio person. I'm the guy who doesn't listen to music in the car on the way here to work. I'm the guy who tends to listen to talk radio, and everything was just getting me so depressed. So yeah, I think that with all the negativity in the world, I need to focus on some things that are positive and fun and happy and allow for positive connections with others. And this has really done it. I just started doing this about 7 months ago, and it couldn't have been more fun. And it has blown me away with how much fun I've had and how many connections I've made. It has been a really awesome experience.